So before we start with today's assignment, I want you guys to turn to page 56 of your notes, and we're going to review a little before you actually start on these genetics problems that we'll be working on today. Last time in our notes, at the very end, and you haven't really gotten a chance to go over this yet, your notes spoke about the first, of the 3 Mendelian principles. And so Mendel studied genetics, so he studied how genes are passed on to offspring, how your genes can be passed on to your children, or how your parents' genes were passed on to you. Well, we needed to know from Mendel were his 3 principles. Now, his first principle, we've kind of discussed this before when we started talking about your traits, about your hitchhiker's thumb, or about being able to roll your tongue. The first law, or first principle, was the principle of dominance. In the principle of dominance, what we basically said was that there is one trait. You have one trait. And remember, traits are coded for from your genes. And you can actually have different versions of this trait. So in the principle of dominance, it says a dominant allele. And let's remind ourselves that is a different version of a trait. And also know that there are only, in Mendels Law, there's only 2 possible different traits. So for example, if our trait was our thumb, our hitchhiker's thumb, we had 2 versions. The first was having the hitchhiker's thumb, and the second was having a straight thumb. Like I had a straight thumb, and if your thumb was bent back more, then you had a hitchhiker's thumb. Those are the only 2 versions, or the only 2 alleles for this trait for your thumb. So we do need to practice these vocabulary words. So today what we're going to first start on is going to be your preview for Unit 3.3. Your preview is going to be on page A55. So if you'll take a minute and turn to page A55. While you're turning to page A55, you'll also want to have out both of your pink vocab sheets from this unit. I don't think we've had a chance yet to go over the last column of vocabulary word and matching that up with our definitions. So I went ahead and started matching them up for you to help you get through this preview assignment. Remember, in the first part of the preview, what you need to do is pick 2 vocabulary words from the 3rd column. The words are allele, genotype, recessive, and carrier. Hopefully you've already tried to match these up. And to remind ourselves, remember that an allele is actually a version of a gene. That is going to be definition I. If your letters are a little off, please make sure that you double check that this was the definition that you're labeling on your pink vocab sheet. The second vocab word was genotype, and a genotype is 2 letters that represent a gene, or the traits that a person has. Obviously, you can see here, I didn't write down the whole definition, but this is the first part of that definition. The third vocabulary word is recessive, and this means that this is a version, or an allele actually, that can be covered up by the dominant allele. And then we have the word carrier. Carrier is going to be a recessive trait that can actually be hidden. That means you have the gene, or you have the allele of the gene. You don't display this, but you can pass it on. Usually people that are carriers are going to be known as heterozygous. So a couple things here before you continue with this, and I do want you to make some notes on your vocab. When you talk about an allele, it's a version of a gene. So when we think of a gene is going to code for a trait. Remember that genes code for a trait. So if we think of an allele and try to think of an example, this could be our hitchhiker's thumb. Being dominant, having the dominant allele, which is represented by a capital A, is going to give us hitchhiker's thumb. But if we had a lowercase a, the recessive allele for this gene or for this trait, then we had a straight thumb. Okay? Same thing for tongue rolling. For your tongue, if you were dominant, you were able to roll your tongue. But if you were recessive, then you were not able to roll your tongue. And we saw in our class that we only had a few people that had these recessive alleles, two lowercase letters, that did not allow for them to roll their tongue. Now when you look at this, you look at hitchhiker's thumb and straight thumb, and you look at big A and little a, this actually also describes one of these vocabulary words. When we're looking at the actual description or what the person actually display based on their traits, that's going to be the phenotype. So here, when you have hitchhiker's thumb or straight thumb, these are going to be examples of phenotypes. And when you think of phenotype, I want you to think of physical. Okay? And you can even write these notes right on the side of your preview. And then your A's here, these letters are going to represent your genes. So genotype sounds like genes. Two letters that represent a specific trait. So for genotype, let's do some examples here. For genotype, if I had a hitchhiker's thumb, I could be big A, big A. As long as I had one big A, I would have a hitchhiker's thumb, a thumb that was bent. Or if I had big A, I would be able to roll my tongue. However, I could also be big A, little a. That could be my genotype for being able to roll my tongue. If I could not roll my tongue, I would have to be little a, little a. Okay? Because that said I either had a straight thumb or I was not able to roll my tongue. When you look at the next vocabulary word, the word recessive, this actually refers to genotypes. If I am recessive, I actually have to have two lowercase letters, two alleles for the recessive trait. And so you just have to remember that a recessive trait is something that is represented by lowercase letters. Then the last vocabulary word, carrier, actually refers to this genotype right here, big A, little a. And this means that I have an allele, a version of a trait that says I can roll my tongue. But I also have an allele that says I cannot roll my tongue. What is my phenotype? What will I actually display? What will I show? I will actually be able to roll my tongue, but I can pass on the trait for not being able to roll my tongue to my children. I want you to take about 10 minutes to work on page A55, preview 3.3. Okay, make sure you get a copy of it if you don't have one with you. And about 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, we're going to review a little bit of your notes from last time, and we'll actually work on some practice problems as well. So go ahead and pause the video now. Okay, after you finished your preview, I do want you to turn to your notes for a second. And in your notes, you're going to be on page 58. So your notes are on page 58, and this was actually from the other day. And on page 58, we talked about Mendel and his 3 principles. This is the basic genetics that we first have to understand. And Mendel's principle, Mendel basically said that you can have a trait that is dominant or recessive. And that's it. That's your only option. You either have it or you don't have it. For example, tongue rolling or not tongue rolling. Okay? Rolling was dominant. Not being able to roll was recessive. big A, can mask or hide the recessive allele. So what does that mean? We have to go back to the vocabulary words that we just mentioned at the beginning, genotype and phenotype. Genotype is literally your genes, or what you inherit. What did you get from your mom or dad? Phenotype is going to be physical. How do those genes look? Now, of course, some genes are going to represent things that happen inside your body, but a lot of the traits that we're going to talk about are things that we can see, like our hitchhiker's thumb or tongue roll. To describe our genotype, there's 3 different terms that we need to know. We need to know homozygous. We also need to know heterozygous. And please copy these notes if you're missing them. And we also need to know dominant recessive. Okay? We already talked about how dominant means you have a big letter. And recessive means you have a lowercase letter. You can have 3 types of genotypes. If you're homozygous dominant, that means you have 2 big A's. That means you'll have 2 big A's or receive 2 alleles from each parent, mom and dad, that says you can roll your tongue. So that means your dominant trait is expressed. For example, your tongue roll. If you are homozygous recessive, that means you got an allele from mom and from dad, 2 little A's, that says you cannot roll your tongue. So your recessive trait is expressed. Or the dominant trait is not expressed. Then you have heterozygous. And just like before, hetero, just like heterosexual, means different. So you have 2 different alleles, big A, little a, and this means that your dominant trait is still expressed. Okay? It's going to cover up the other. This little portion right here is what we need to know for today's practice problems, our first set of genetics problems. So we're going to stop there and we'll talk about principle of segregation, separating a little later. I do want you to write that right now, separating. And principle of independent assortment. We'll also mention those 2 later on. I want you to keep these notes out, or keep your finger there, and turn to page AFFF. So, in your notes, in your handbook, if you were to turn to page AFF, on page AFF we have some practice problems on these genetics. Things are either going to be dominant or they're going to be recessive. I do want you to make sure that you have your notes still out. So take out this page. This page is actually right behind that alleles assignment that we started on earlier in the unit. And after you've turned to that, and I'll actually show you, this was the alleles assignment. It had the paragraph that we read over and filled in the blank and answered the questions on the bottom. It's right on the back. So if you don't have it in the right spot, you probably take it and out and put it in the front of your binder. But in these human genetics problems, I want to go over the first one with you, and then I'm going to leave a little key so you can check the second one. And I'm also going to leave some extra practice problems for you as well. On number 1, please read while I'm reading it to you. Please read along. It says, a woman has cystic fibrosis, a recessive disease that causes mucus to accumulate in her lungs. Her husband was recently tested and found to be a carrier of the recessive allele. So she has cystic fibrosis. It tells you that it's a recessive disease. So if I'm going to express a recessive disease, what letters do I need? Looking back to your notes, what did it say? It said that you had to have little a, little a. And we'll just stick to A's because they're really easy to tell apart. Then it says her husband was tested and found to be a carrier of the recessive allele. If you're a carrier, what does your genotype have to be? Has to be big A, little a. So, in the first question, blank would be the allele for normal, and blank would be for cystic fibrosis. We want to use the letters here, the genotypes here. So big A means you're normal. Little a is for cystic fibrosis because it's a recessive disease. Then it says, what is the genotype of the woman? Well, we've already said if she's having a recessive disease, she has to have little a, little a. It's just like not being able to roll your tongue. You'd have to have little a, little a. This is described as blank zygous. So if the letters, both letters are the same, is that hetero or homo? That's actually going to be homozygous. And C, what is the genotype of her husband? Well, up here, we already mentioned that he was a carrier. That means he can pass on the gene for the disease, but that he is normal for the disease. He doesn't have the disease, so he's big A, little a. Two different letters, what does that mean? Or what is that described as? Two different, so that's going to be heterozygous. What we need to do next is draw and fill in a Punnett square, and this is where you really need to pay attention. We're going to draw a little box and separate it. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually write the genotypes of both of the parents. So first, I'll go ahead, I always start with whoever was named first, with the mom, and she was little a, little a. And next, we had the dad, he was big A, little a. Homozygous mom, heterozygous dad. Whenever you're doing this, you're actually just going to drop the letters into the box. But one thing to keep in mind, if you have one capital letter, you always write it first, just like when you're writing the beginning of a sentence. So the first box here is going to be big A, little a. Next box down, I have little a, little a. Next box across, I have big A, little a. And the last box, I have two little a's. Okay? Again, capital letter always goes first. Next, we have to say we have to answer what is the chance they will have. The Punnett square is giving you percentages. It says if this couple has a child, what is their chance of having the disease, not having the disease, being a carrier, not being a carrier. And so this is a child with cystic fibrosis. Well, if you have cystic fibrosis, you have to have little a, little a. So these two boxes down here. What we're going to write is a fraction, 2 out of 4, or what percentage is that? That's going to be 50%. Next, a normal child, so a child without the disease. Well, these two, because they have two capital A's, don't have the disease. So that'll be 2 out of 4 again, and another 50%. Next, we have a child that is a carrier. What does it mean to be a carrier? That means that you don't have the disease, but you could pass it on. Again, if you're heterozygous, that means you're a carrier. So that's 2 out of 4 again, or 50%. Now, it might look like that might always happen, but it won't. Sometimes you might have 2 big A's, okay? So you do have to make sure you look back and count. And the fourth question, a child that is big N, little n, or heterozygous would have what phenotype? This means what are their genes going to be expressed as? So this, they would actually be normal. They won't have the disease, that's what normal means in this case. And they're going to be carriers and pass on the disease. Again, you'll have one more genetics assignment where I'll actually give you a sheet with hints, and then another key for Mr. Jansky to check with you guys.